People don't give the SG-1000 enough credit, but that's about to change. Our first title this episode is almost completely superfluous because we've almost seen this exact same game over on Othello Multivision. That's right, it's, wait for it, Sega's cartridge adaptation of Othello. If you are one of the unfortunate kids whose families bought an Othello Multivision, you've pretty much seen this game. It's Othello. This cartridge's contents don't match 100% to those of the ROM that Othello rights holder Sukuda Original built into the Multivision, but it's close. After all, there's only so much you can do with that concept. As far as I'm aware, Sukuda Original never published an Othello game with, say, an alternate mode for chess or checkers or anything. It was always just plain Othello. Though in the strictest and most technical sense, I suppose this cartridge wasn't published by Sukuda Original. As with all other proper SG-1000 releases, Sega handled the publishing duties here themselves. We can take that as a sign that Sukuda Original had given up on its dreams of being a console-making superpower. The final Multivision release arrived sometime in 1984, and not even the suave sex appeal of secret agent James Bond could convince the citizens of Japan that they needed to own an awkward variant model of the second most popular console on the market. Sega's Othello makes some modest aesthetic tweaks to the game, mostly to do with the logos. The Othello logo is now red instead of blue, presumably to stand out from the blue Sega logo that now sits at the top right of the screen. Sega was not in a habit of emblazoning their console games with a corporate logo as a matter of course, and even the Pachinko series on SG-1000 only had a tiny white Sega logo at the bottom of the screen. In that light, the chunky, multicolored logo you see here strikes me as the equivalent of a cry of triumph screamed while standing over the body of a vanquished foe. Corporate teabagging, if you will. You will spot a more meaningful change in the space below the Sega name. The right column's text display has changed quite a bit from the Sukuda version of the game, in large part because this version can be played entirely with a 2-button controller rather than needing to make use of the Multivision's built-in alphanumeric mini keypad. Otherwise, the two versions appear to be functionally identical. It certainly is possible the computer's play routines use completely separate logic here from the Sukuda original version of the game, but honestly, I couldn't say. Othello is, Othello, reversey. There's only so much you can do with it, especially on such limited hardware. Anyway, RIP to Sukuda Original, the first of the would-be first-party Japanese console superpowers to meekly become someone else's third-party licensee. Though hardly the last. And we have one final cartridge release for SG-1000, more or less. And it kind of brings things full circle. Fittingly, as Sega's fond farewell to their original media format for SG-1000, we have an adaptation of the game that made Japan fall in love with video games in the first place. That's right, it's Space Invaders. This version is pretty much, Space Invaders. At this point, the game was a good 7 years old, so this really is what passed for retro in 1985. Even though Japanese-made consoles had existed since 1981 in the epic CassetteVision, Taito didn't sanction an official Space Invaders port to any of them until 1985, when the game arrived on both SG-1000 and Famicom. American consoles had enjoyed licensed renditions of the game for years by this point. Space Invaders was a huge hit for Atari 2600. And of course, there were countless knockoffs to be found. But this is the real thing, and despite its age, Sega handled it well. In fact, the SG-1000 adaptation is generally regarded as a more accurate and faithful take on the arcade classic than Taito's own Famicom release. Given the minimalism of both games, you could say this amounts to splitting hairs, but the SG-1000 release really does sound more faithful to the arcade version. The Invaders themselves look a bit more like those in the original game, and the gameplay fares a bit better, though neither is entirely arcade accurate. The SG-1000 release is based on the later, full-color revisions of the arcade game. Rather than using monochrome graphics or simulating the cellophane color bands of some releases, it simply assigns a different color to each group of invaders. However, it doesn't introduce any of the elements of Space Invaders 2, such as aliens that split into smaller creatures when hit. The gameplay is still just, Space Invaders. Aliens march left to right in a unified formation of 5 rows and 11 columns. When the leading edge of the formation hits the edge of the screen, the entire fleet descends a row and begins shuffling right to left, continuing this march until they eventually reach the bottom, or else the player's defense cannon knocks them out of the sky. Although the SG-1000 version necessarily alters the arcade's vertical aspect ratio to match the horizontal format of home consoles, it still plays correctly. You face the proper number of aliens, the invaders accelerate as you whittle down their numbers, and you can duck behind shields for safety, until the shields get shot to pieces anyway. Space Invaders feels like something of a relic here in 1985, but given the popularity of the game and how effectively this version recreates the gameplay, I have to imagine it did reasonably well for itself. A little video game comfort food to wrap up the SG-1000 cartridge legacy. And that wraps it up for SG-1000 cartridges. Thanks for watching Segaiden. We're done now. Well, no, actually we're not. Just because that's the end of cartridges for SG-1000 does not mean that's the end of the system's life. Instead, the platform shifted media formats, going from the chunky black cartridges to the slim, credit card-sized MyCard. The MyCard format is not completely unknown to Americans, thanks to the gloriously literal packaging that Sega and Tonka used for Sega Master System's Sega Card format releases. But where the US received only a handful of MyCard games, the SG-1000 and Sega Mark III saw literally dozens of them in Japan. It probably will not surprise you to learn that we do not have a great deal of transparency into the exact timing of this format changeover more than 35 years later. The SG-1000's successor model, the Mark III, debuted in Japan on October 20th, 1985. But as always, the exact timing of releases and milestones for the SG-1000 remain shrouded in a haze of time and lousy bookkeeping by Sega. The Mark III shipped with the ability to play both cartridges and cards, but it seems unlikely that Sega didn't start selling card-based games until October 1985. The company released 22 SG-1000 MyCard games in 1985 alone, which is an awful lot to crowd into 2 months while also trying to promote a new, more powerful console model. No, most likely Sega released its final 8 cartridge games, Zaxxon through Space Invaders, concurrently in 1985 with the changeover to MyCards, phasing out one format while ramping up another. The SG-1000 only had a cartridge slot though, so a hardware-based solution was required to enable compatibility. Enter the card catcher. Essentially a pass-through pin connector, the card catcher sat in the SG-1000's cartridge slot and allowed players to plug a card into the console. Like the power-based converter for Genesis many years later, the card catcher is not a system in a cartridge like Nintendo's Super Game Boy. It's just a simple pin adapter. In fact, you can plug it into the Mark III's cartridge slot and it will work just fine, even if it's completely redundant. Sega shifted to the card format for a few reasons. First, and most amusingly, Sega's designer behind SG-1000 came to find the cartridge format morbid, as he felt the black slabs of plastic rising up from the console's low-profile surface looked like tombstones. I'm not sure the card catcher really solved this issue for the SG-1000, since the cards just looked like slimmer tombstones. However, the Mark III's card port would be situated at the front of the console and required cards to be inserted parallel to the surface on which the console was seated. The second reason, evidently, has to do with economics. Supposedly, the MyCard format costs less to manufacture than cartridges, and would allow the SG-1000 to compete against Nintendo's Famicom more aggressively on pricing. I'm not sure this claim holds up to scrutiny. A quick survey of SegaRetro.org reveals original retail prices for the SG-1000 line, and there doesn't appear to have been an appreciable price drop once MyCard took over. Zaxxon on cartridge, for example, retailed at 4,300 yen, about $40, while Zoom 909 on MyCard originally sold for 4,800, about $45. Of course, it may not have been a matter of passing the savings along to customers, but rather bulking up the corporate coffers. Mark III and Master System cards would be cheaper than cartridges, but on SG-1000, it was just a thing that happened. Anyway, just about everything to be released for SG-1000 from here on out will arrive in the card format, with only 2 exceptions: The Castle in 1986 and Sherlock Holmes, Loretto no Shoujo, one of the 2 final SG-1000 games released in 1987. Sega's shift in formats presages Nintendo's move to Famicom Disk System a year later, though MyCards didn't offer tangible benefits over carts. They were simply tinier. They did, however, allow Sega to refresh some of its better-selling games, not unlike the way Nintendo reissued a bunch of its Pulse line games on Disk System at launch. All told, 5 cartridges made their way to SG-1000 MyCards. Champion Golf, Monaco GP, Zippy Race, Champion Boxing, and Star Force. These versions reportedly feature extremely minor code revisions over the cartridge releases, but nothing substantial. They're simply a smaller physical edition of the same game. It's interesting that some of the games that seem like SG-1000 standouts, like Flicky, Girls Garden, and Zaxxon, didn't benefit from coming to the smaller format. I suppose what Sega deemed a significant title at the time doesn't necessarily line up with the retrospective view. Sega gave each SG-1000 release a numeric catalog code number beginning with G1001 and running all the way through G1046, the castle. The games that made the jump from cartridge to card received a new catalog number that corresponded to their original code. Champion Golf, for example, was originally released as G1005 and reissued as C05. The MyCard numeration for new releases more or less picks up from the cartridge line with a small amount of overlap. Space Invaders shipped as G1045, and the first original non-reissue card title, Dragon Wang, shipped as C46. This suggests there may not have been much or even any overlap between cart and card releases, given the continuity of Sega's numbering. At the very least, by the time Dragon Wand was assigned its catalog number, Sega seems to have had a definitive plan for when it would be shutting down the cartridge line. Curiously, there would end up being some small overlap between catalog codes, in that Dragon Wand is C46, and the castle would ship the following year as G1046. This means nothing in the grand scheme of things, of course, it's merely an interesting bookkeeping quirk. Anyway, let's talk about the games. Sega's very first release for the SG-1000 MyCard format sees the company taking on a popular arcade and Famicom hit head-on. Dragon Wand, and that's pronounced Wan, not Wang, is more or less Irem's Kung Fu. This game is not as good as Irem's Kung Fu, but the idea comes through pretty clearly. As in Irem's Kung Fu, you take control of a hero, the eponymous Dragon Wand, who has to brawl his way through a multi-story dojo, fending off enemy martial artists from all sides. The bad guys constantly beset you, steadily attempting to sap your health and rob you of a life. The general mix of enemies bears strong similarities to Kung Fu as well, albeit pared down. You primarily battle brawlers and knife throwers, with none of the little short guys jumping at you that you saw in Kung Fu. Brawlers simply walk at you and launch a kick as soon as they step within range. Knife throwers naturally like to hover further away and toss their daggers at you, either high or low. Dragon Wand can jump over knives at both heights, although it's easier to duck the high blades. Since their wielders don't really have any visual tells to indicate which height they'll be throwing knives at, however, it's generally safer just to jump everything. There are some curious limitations to enemy attack patterns. For example, they never pass one another, meaning you can lower the heat level of a given situation by causing a bunch of brawlers to stack up behind a knife guy, marching forward while the dagger thrower blocks the passage and chucks knives from a distance. The bad guys do make up for their limitations by being a lot nastier than Kung Fu's enemies. There's a preposterously brief window in which to strike an approaching combatant before they lash out and hit you, a matter of single-digit frames. It doesn't help that Dragon Wand lacks Thomas's martial arts prowess. He can't punch at all, only kick high or low, duck, and leap. You can kind of, but not really, combine these abilities to jump kick foes, though the timing of your actions means you only launch your strike as you're landing. The jump kick here is far from the all-purpose bacon saver that it would go on to be in Double Dragon a few years later. The one thing Dragon Wand handles more ambitiously than Kung Fu is in the structure of its dojo. Rather than marching floor by floor to the boss, here you have a little more flexibility. The first dojo comprises 3 floors, and while you simply can trudge all the way to the right along the first floor until you face off against the first floor boss, that approach is by no means mandatory. On the contrary, taking such a direct approach can work to your disadvantage, as the first floor is packed with knife fighters who can and will whittle down your health as they box you in. Rather than simply take the path of most resistance, you can instead make use of the holes you'll find located at various points along the ceilings and floors of the dojo. Leap or drop through these openings and you'll switch to a different floor, leaving behind any pursuers on the level you've just left behind. The dojo's guardians occupy opposite ends of the building on each floor. At the far right of the lowest floor, you'll find a bow staff wielder. The boss of the floor above him waits back at the far left, immediately above where the game begins, ready to pummel you with nunchaku. You face the third floor boss, a teleporter, who curiously shares a name with a contemporaneous Famicom release by Namco, Warpman, back at the far right of the structure. And if you can survive long enough to reach the second stage of the game, you'll encounter a fourth boss at the left end of the fourth floor. Or maybe you won't encounter him. This boss fires projectiles that fly in a sine wave pattern, like high-speed Castlevania Medusae, which prove infuriatingly difficult to dodge while using the clunky controls of Dragon 1. You can tackle bosses in any order you like, but in order to complete a stage, you do have to defeat them all. Each boss holds a key that you need to collect in order to unlock the chamber where your game objective, a lady wearing Chinese hair buns and a kipao, awaits you. Acquiring a key refills Dragon 1's health, although you never power up here or grow in power or durability, or gain any weapons. Still, each dojo does seem to have an optimal route to reach each boss with minimal friction. And determining the best path forward is probably the closest thing this game offers to a proper strategy. Some floors contain barriers that you can smash away, while others, beginning with Stage 2, are obstructed by indestructible walls. It takes considerable practice to learn your way through the game, and the bad guys are pretty unrelenting in their advance and their attacks. I suppose there's something to be said for having a watered-down version of a popular arcade landmark available for SG-1000, but I can't say this would have been my first choice for the MyCard's first release. You know, were I Sega, which I'm not. Unfortunately for Dragon 1, Kung Fu, or Spartan X, would ship on Famicom around the same time, possibly even ahead of this release. And there's just no comparing the two, despite or perhaps because of their obvious similarities. Dragon 1 is a tolerable but clunky clone of Kung Fu, whereas the Famicom release didn't simply adapt a big arcade hit, it was brilliantly redesigned and programmed by Nintendo's top internal team as a warm-up for Super Mario Bros. Well, maybe next time, SG-1000. And speaking of next time on Segaiden, things begin looking up a bit.